to Learning in Action's Heal the Divide Podinar series. Our topic today is the neuroscience of effective coaching, and our guest is Richard Boyatzis. I'm Allison Whitmire, the president of Learning in Action, and I'm joined by my colleague, Sarah Bush, our training coordinator. Hi, Sarah.
Hello, good afternoon.
Thank you for being here.
Pleasure.
And Sarah will be watching the chat box, so Richard and I aren't distracted today. Our mission at Learning in Action is to heal the divide. And what that means to us is to heal the ways in which we become divided from our essence, the essence of who we are. And when we heal the ways in which we're divided from our essence, we'll heal what is divided between us. So what's a Podinar? It's a cross between a podcast and a webinar. Today's going to be a little bit more webinar style. We, as I referred to earlier, the more that I can hear Richard speak, the better. And frankly, I didn't want to get in the way of what he has to say and teach by asking him a bunch of questions. And so we're giving him the stage today. So it's a little bit different today than in previous months. Without further ado, I'm super happy to introduce our guest, Richard Boyatzis. He's the Distinguished University Professor of Case Western Reserve University, professor in the departments of Organizational Behavior, Psychology, Cognitive Science, and H.R. Horvis Professor of Family Business. Using his intentional change theory, he studies sustained, desired change of individuals, teams, organizations, communities, and countries since 1967. He's the author of more than 200 articles and 9 books on leadership, competencies, emotional intelligence, competency development, coaching, neuroscience, and management education, including the international bestseller, Primal Leadership, with Dan Goleman and Annie McKee, and his recent book, which I'm hearing wonderful reviews about, and I can give a wonderful review as well, Helping People Change, with Melvin Smith and Ellen Van Oosten. So with that, welcome, Richard. Oh, you're on mute.
Thanks. Seldom am I that quiet. So thank you, Allison and Sarah, for inviting me to speak with this array. If any of you have heard me before at IOC or any of the ICF chapters, or who knows. Anyway, sorry if we go over some material as before, but of all the groups that I talk to, I know a lot of people on the circuit of giving a lot of talks who always brag about how many CEOs they talk to. On the whole, having spent a lot of time with CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, honestly, I find most of them boring. Because 70 to 80% of them aren't very effective. They aren't adding any value. And oddly enough, it's amazing how few of them have a real passion for what they do. They're busy, but that's different. It's us, it's coaches, consultants, OD people, and professors teaching us that is my more exciting audience, because I think we're the ones who actually make it happen, while trying to make sure that the better things are happening. It's not just more tasks, more performance, more of this ridiculous fixation on metrics and goals, which I'll show today is one of the causes why people don't reach them. But at any rate, so what I'm going to do over the hour is try to go through a number of key ideas. We'll do an exercise kind of early, and feel free to ask questions along the way. I certainly am kind of targeting getting done in about 45 minutes so that we'll have time for questions at the end. But what I'm going to start with is a basic observation that, and by the way, as long as you have access to the slides, my email's right there. So if you want to get in touch with me, to either follow up on some resources I talked about or to share something with me, please feel free. My message today starts with the observation that all learning and change is stressful because it always involves self-control and always involves moving into areas of uncertainty. And no matter how much somebody puts on a happy face, I think on the whole, when people say they're looking forward to change and adapting, they're lying because it's not natural for people to want to do that unless they're an adrenaline junkie, in which case they're delusional about themselves anyway. So the dilemma that we have is that pre-COVID, the amount of stress that any of us as professionals or executives are under is beyond the norm that our bodies were designed for. It's to the point where we medically call it strain. And by the way, it's not the accumulation of acute stress that's the issue. It's the accumulation of annoying stress. You know, your cell phone drops the calls, computer's slow to boot up. You know, Sarah had it when I didn't sign on at 12:45 today. Those are the things that build up in any given day. And at the level that most of us are exposed to pre-COVID on this amount of annoying stress, we are cognitively, perceptually, and emotionally impaired. I'll get into more of the details in a little bit. When you add the major acute stressor of COVID, and even though the likelihood, I mean, it's sad if a family member or a close friend has died, but the likelihood of contracting the virus is minuscule in percentage terms. You're more likely to be in an auto accident, but the a real acute stress that's been caused by the virus has been the financial disruption in many people's lives and the social disruption. Now we add to that acute stressor the social and political disruption we've been having, you know, with all of the various protests and riots and all these kinds of things going on, that it's pretty amazing that we're not a mess. I mean, that's actually quite positive that as many people as are functioning well and doing their work and helping to inspire others are. But what it raises is that we as coaches end up not only having the client's issues to deal with, but we have our own. And because of the emotional contagion, as soon as a client starts in talking about how, you know, their job sucks or some part of their life is falling apart, or sadly, they've had a loved one contract the virus, that immediately infects us. And again, I'll go into the details of the neuroscience, but it actually crosses brains in 8 to 40 thousandths of a second. So it's way below consciousness. Now, when we add to all of that, what we're experiencing as coaches, as helpers, sometimes people might experience it as executives, or certainly any of us who are parents. We also have another dose, which Dave McClellan called power stress. And this is the stress that comes of feeling responsible. So you put all that together and you say, boy, if we're not spending a lot of time tending to our renewal, tending to our state of feeling inspired about life, we are more likely to bring our clients down than to help them without even saying a word. So part of my message today is, what are some of the more effective ways, or affirming some of the ways many of us already do, but to clarify a few of the things that there's a lot of rhetoric about in coaching certification and a lot of coach training that is just plain wrong. You know, they're kind of sacred cows, but I'll highlight them as we go on. That when we get new research every year, we're starting to discover some of these things that we can do, often with adjustments or being a little careful about sequencing. But at the same time, we have to do these for ourselves, because our ability to be sustainable in terms of getting somebody else excited about being open to new ideas or to possibilities starts with us. So it is impossible to talk about emotions and relationships without getting into some of it. So let's do an exercise. What I'd like you to do is on a piece of paper in front of you, if possible. I think it's a lot easier on paper than typing it, but I'd like you to think about who has helped you the most in your whole life, not just work, your life. Who has helped you the most become who you are or get to where you are? And I'm going to go silent for about 20, 30 seconds and let you write down some names of people who has helped you the most become who you are or get to where you are. Now, what I'd like you to do is to go back to the first person on your list and think of a moment you had with them in which you learned something important. Now, if you put down a mother or father, or a grandparent, you might have had hundreds, if not thousands of these moments, but let your memory filter through and latch onto one, and then replay the video of that moment in your head, like you're watching a YouTube video, and write a few notes next to their name about what they said or did in that event. And see if you can do that for the first person. And if you have time, do it for the second and keep going. I'll go silent for about 45, 50 seconds and let you do some reflections and writing. I apologize for interrupting your reflections. What I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to use the chat feature to type in a word or two that describes how you feel right now as you're remembering these people, your relationships to them, and this moment in which you learned something important. How are you feeling right now? And I'll just talk about thankful, grateful, calm, empowered, happy, a lot more grateful, centered, affirmed, blessed, more grateful, empowered, expansive, strong, genuinely grateful, loved, sad, missing the person, valued, some more blessed, inspired, supported, lucky, fortunate, relieved, grounded. Somebody went to very blessed, not just blessed, genuine, surprised, heard, again, more grateful, seen, appreciative. This is a great list. I've done this exercise on all 7 continents, yes, including Antarctica, in about 50 countries. And it turns out that it doesn't matter whether we're in Astana, Kazakhstan, or Milano, or here in Boston, where I am right now, because humans answer the same way. And people throughout the world say, as you did, I felt really loved. I felt grateful. I felt thankful. I felt honored, appreciative. I felt blessed that somebody cared about me that much. In the moment, I'm feeling excited and elated, lifted, but also some of you said serene, centered, and some said sad because the person has passed away. If you had any of those feelings, You just spent about 4 minutes in the parasympathetic nervous system. I'll get to exactly why that's so important in a few minutes, but let me say the shorthand is that this is the only psychophysiological state that ameliorates stress. I have a paper that's coming out this month in the Consulting Psychology Journal on personal sustainability, and based on a series of studies we did, and another paper that's under review right now on resilience and emotional intelligence. And part of the message is that when everybody thinks they're going to work on stress by reducing stress, they're fooling themselves. You may or may not be able to reduce the amount of stress, but you cannot, by working on stress, revise it or reverse the damages. The only thing you could do is increase the renewal. So I'm going to focus a lot on that today. And one of the reasons I do this exercise is I want all of us to have more practice knowing what it feels like. What are the sensations, as my friend and doctoral student Mandy Blake talks about somatic coaching. What are the feelings you have when you're in renewal? Because it's different than rest or relaxation or boredom. It's a different state. So you got a chance to get a little dose of that right now. By the way, if you haven't talked to one of these people lately, give them a call, maybe Zoom with them. Don't just email. And if sadly they passed away, get out your photograph album or some of your photo files tomorrow morning. Make a cup of coffee or tea and sit and remember moments with them. What a great way to honor their gift. The most important question I'm going to ask you in this session, we're not going to analyze, but I want you to think about it. Now, because we're coaches and professional helpers, it's a little bit of a cheat question compared to the two groups of executives I talked to yesterday. But here's the question. Whose list will you be on? Whose list will you be on? There are only two ways to have a legacy in life, folks. One is to donate money to a university, and the other, I'm actually paid to say that. But truly, excuse me, the only way to have a legacy in life is through the relationships that we form that are important to people. So this is a very special thing to consider. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to expand what we just did in the exercise and start to analyze it. And to do that, I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. In 1967, in 66, I should preface it, my parents are immigrants from Greece. By the time my father got to this country in 1938, he was 22. He was drafted in the Army, kind of learned to speak English in the Army, clearing out the jungles of Panama. And then his English was fairly conversant by the time he reached Normandy Beach and went through France and Germany. So he gets back to the US, and he had met my mother. She lived across the street from his brother, and they'd gotten married. So there was no way he could return to university which he was doing in Greece. But he became a waiter. And for my entire life, my father worked from 3 p.m. to 3 a.m. In later years, after I had left the house, he started to get one night off a week, but that was after. And in all of that, I'd had a lot of challenges in school because of differences that were not valued. PS 150 had tried to lead me back 3 times because they thought I was cognitively slow in Queens. And the first time was because I spoke English, it was in kindergarten. I spoke English with a Greek accent. I could read Greek letters, but I couldn't read English letters. And in 1950, that was seen as a sign of retardation, not multiculturalism, and a few things like that. But God bless her, my mother used to fight like hell for me in those cases, kept me out of school, caught me up, put me back in, and also taught me during that time a message that has really helped me, which is to really be self-reliant and to really take responsibility for myself. And now she got a little carried away with it and used to kind of inundate me from the time I was 5 onward about how all of you folks in North America, especially those of you who come from Europe or any country other than Greece, were out to get me. And so there was a certain amount of that bolstering. But what happened was when Sputnik went up, and some of you may be old enough to remember this, there was a paroxysm in the United States, and every student was tested. Well, that spring, they tested me, and now we'd moved out to a small working class community on Long Island, and they decided that I was really smart, especially in math and physics. So my proclivity to want to be in the space program and actually get into space was exaggerated by the schools. And before I know it, everything I wanted was around physics or math or calculus. And I got into MIT and I specialized. I was in aeronautics and astronautics, and I specialized in control systems of interplanetary vehicles, designing them. I ran out of money because I was putting myself through school predominantly. And they got me a job doing rocket science for Northrop Nordair. So I'm out there for about 6.5 months, and I come back from LA, absolutely convinced the last thing in the world I want to do was that for a living. And I didn't know quite what to do. I mean, I didn't want to go back into the restaurant business. Every male in my extended family on this side of the Atlantic was in restaurants. The women all stayed at home, took care of families. And I knew my music wasn't, I mean, I was good enough to make a certain amount of money to help put myself through MIT, but I wasn't good enough to really go pro, I didn't think. So I said, okay, I'll go into management. It's got to be easy. Look at these idiots we had out at Northrop. I mean, I was in one of 2 departments in the research group that were 2 departments of Sheldon's, if you will. An awful lot of people that had trouble making eye contact and were interpersonally quite awkward. But even with all of that, the managers got so little out of us. So at Sloan School, I decided to take a management course or 2. And I was finishing my degree in aeronautics because I'm much too compulsive not to finish things. And one of the professors who got up and they had a thing where they described management courses that didn't have prerequisites. He got up and described a course which sounded like utter crap to me. And it was organizational psychology. And it was a young fellow called David Kolb, who is just finishing his PhD at Harvard at the moment. But he said 2 words in his description of his course that made me race to the basement of Sloan School and get into his class because everything was oversubscribed. So it was an issue of who got there first. And the 2 words were no tests. I like to tell that story because very often the path of our lives changes on seemingly irrelevant criteria. Well, it was in that course that I discovered something. I discovered that I loved this stuff. And I wanted to do my term paper in the course on how managers don't help their subordinates. He said, I've got data from a study we just collected for 2 years on how graduate students at MIT helped or didn't help each other. Would you like to do real data? I said, yes. I killed myself getting this paper done. He offered me a job for the summer. We ended up publishing the paper. And part of why helping and coaching is so near and dear to my heart, because it was the very first thing that I did in psychology that led me to feel like this is really my deep sense of purpose. It was an early version of this theory that he and I were working on in 67, 68, and 69. We ended up publishing a few papers. And then he was one of the people who helped me the most. Another one of my professors at the time, who I didn't know what a giant he was in the field, but it was Ed Schein, who I got very close to. And then Dave McClellan was from Harvard, was doing some visiting courses, and I got to know him. And there was a number of people who took me under the wing and convinced me that I should go to graduate school. I shouldn't go in management. I should go in psychology, and I should go write for a PhD, all of which I did. And they helped me. I got into Harvard. And everything I've been doing since that spring of 1967 is focused around this question: how do people change in sustained, desired ways? So it has to be desired. So I don't care about if people change and go to negative things. And I'm very concerned, always been concerned about sustained change, because a lot of people change for a day, a week, a few weeks. And the classic honeymoon period out of corporate training that shows how relatively ineffective most training and development is at really helping people develop, basically knows that we max out at about 3 to 4 weeks in any learning. And by the time you hit 6 weeks, people have extinguished most of anything they learned. By the way, the impact of higher education in management or helping or any of these things is just as abysmal in terms of its sustaining impact. And what it became clear was, to understand change, we had to take something which, when we first started working on it, I came at it from a physical science perspective that assumes nonlinearity. It's the social sciences that have been horribly simplistic for the better part of the last 80 years, that any natural scientist knows any phenomena is typically nonlinear and discontinuous, which is human behavior and change. And that these moments of emergence, when something pops, when in the 70s, as I was studying competency development, but also working with alcoholics and drug addicts, doing therapy and studying how they could change if they did, it became very clear that the pops, these moments of emergence, fell into 5 categories when people sustainably changed: individuals, dyads, pairs, teams, organizations. Then occasionally I dabble on community and country level change. The first is the red thing, sense of the ideal self, a sense of vision. Who would you love to be? If you have that, or some aspect of it, you're eligible for the second. If you don't, there's less than a 5% chance you'll make it. The second is learning about how you come across to others. That's the real self. What you think of yourself is not the real self. We have plenty of research over 60 years to say it's on the whole delusional. And professional women tend to be underestimators. Professional men are overestimators. The net result is none of us are very accurate at it. But what happens when you do learn about how you're coming across to others, you get a sense, comparing it to your ideal or your personal vision, of your strengths and weaknesses. So if the result of the first discovery is a personal vision, not goals, vision, dream, the result of the second is a personal balance sheet. The third discovery is a learning agenda, and which is not a performance improvement. It's something that you'd love to be doing. The fourth is the work of experimenting with different things and then practicing and practicing and practicing the new thoughts, feelings, and behavior. And all of this happens through the mediating influence of these trusting, resonant, caring relationships. Now, what does this have to do with the exercise we just did? I don't have time to draw out from you in a participative manner, so let me just summarize what's likely to have happened. When we've done research on this, and we started collecting data in 2002 and then writing about it subsequently, what we discovered is that when I would ask this question, 80 to 100% of all the stories in any sample, and we would ask people to come up with 5 people, one moment for each person, 80 to 100% of all the stories came back about the ideal self or about strengths. And it was something like this. I wouldn't be surprised if, when you thought about the person who helped you the most, you named one of your parents or grandparents, sometimes an aunt or an uncle, a teacher, a professor, a coach, maybe in later life, a spouse or partner. And that person asked questions and helped you to consider possibilities, not by saying, Allison, you're a girl, you should be a nurse, but by saying, have you thought of, or remarking on something you found interesting and said, wow, isn't that fascinating? So that literally your dream opens up like a flower and you start to see some sense of purpose, of meaning in life. Or somebody recognized some strengths that you had, believed in you, and gave you some opportunities or trusted you even more than you thought you could do. Now, the reason this is important is because in the research, we asked the converse question: who tried to help you in the last 2 years? And we asked, again, 5 incidents. And very often people tell stories about managers doing performance reviews, coaches, trainers, therapists, whomever, in-laws, people trying to help you. And 67% of every sample we looked at each of over the number of years, they said 2 things typically happened. One, they gave me feedback about how I'm coming across. They told me, this is the result of your behavior. This is how people feel. This is your 360. Here you are on videotape. And how do you feel after you get all this feedback? You feel like you've been punched. Because what's happening is these people, although well-intended, mostly, not always, are being helping bullies. And they focus on your gaps. I can help you with that attitude problem. I can help fix you. Melvin Smith and I started to call this in 2003, coaching with compassion versus coaching for compliance. In my theory, again, using complexity theory, I think inside of each one of us, individually, inside of each of our relationships, our teams, our organizations, our countries, we have at least 2 emotional attractors. And these are, in complexity terms, Lorenz attractors that bring us around them, not into them. And you define the 3 attractors by one dimension, which is parasympathetic renewal, or sympathetic, which is stress arousal of the hormonal system. Thinking and activating the empathic neural network versus activating the analytic neural network, and thinking in positive adjectives versus negative. Now, these 2 states are the 2 states that we discovered in the question of who helped you the most and who tried. And we began to call, Melvin and I did, the PEA coaching with compassion, using a Confucian interpretation of compassion, not a Western. It's not just feeling for people in pain. It's also feeling for people in joy or who want to grow. It's what Aristotle called eudaimonic as well as hedonic. And that this is very different than what happens when people try to help others, which usually means they're trying to fix you. They're giving you tips, all sorts of stuff like that, which activates the negative emotional attractor. And all you have to do is make a person feel defensive mildly, arouse anything evaluative, anything comparative, and you're arousing the negative emotional attractor. This is the difference between thinking about possibilities versus problems, dreams versus expectations, optimism versus pessimism. And I love this. Optimists call themselves optimists. Pessimists call themselves realists. It's the difference in hope versus fear, strengths versus weaknesses, excited about trying something versus performance improvement plans, and a lot of things about novelty versus shoulds, and resonant versus dissonant relationships. Now, the 2, if you will, most important learning from this session, the money observations, I often call it, are 1, sustained desired change almost always starts in the positive emotional attractor. Why? I will explain a little bit in a few minutes, but when you start in the negative emotional attractor, you activate all the stress stuff and the analytic network, which causes a person to close down. They literally close their mind and they're not open to new ideas. They're in a protective defensive mode. And in that process, the research is very clear. As soon as you activate the stress system, as soon as you activate the analytic neural network, the person's closing down. And we even have data that peripheral vision goes from 180 degrees down to 30. And this is why so many people can't change. This is why those of us who are volume challenged can't lose weight. It's negatively framed. This is why treatment adherence is abysmally low. I mean, whether you have type 2 diabetes or you break an ankle or have a knee replacement, your doctor tells you or nurse tells you a bunch of things to do. Treatment adherence is about 50%. People do about half of what they're supposed to do to get better. My cardiac thoracic surgeon friends of mine and students tell me that it's about 20% for cardiac bypass surgery. Why? It's because physicians and nurses try to scare the hell out of you. Well, if you don't start exercising and lose weight and eat the right foods, We're going to have to put you on insulin. And then at some point you get neuropathy and we'll have to amputate your feet. You know, that's not motivating. It's frightening, but it's not motivating. Now, here is a very, very important and a little bit controversial because it could be counterintuitive. When you give constructive criticism, it's still criticism. Don't fool yourself. Just because you have a good intent doesn't mean the other person experiences that way. There is one condition in which feedback is useful, and that's the condition where the person has genuinely asked for it. But believe me, that is really seldom. Most of the time when people want feedback or they say, tell me feedback, they're going like this, yeah, give me some feedback. And the fact is that most of the time people don't want it at all. When you open, any of us who are certified in coaching know that to pass our coaching exams, we had to agree that you take the client's presenting problem as the context for your coaching conversation. I'm here to tell you that, yes, you should lie and say that's true for your certification, otherwise you won't get certified, but it's not true. It actually leads to less effective or ineffective coaching. I'm not saying we don't solve problems, but if the context of your opening and your relationship with the client is a problem, it's the NEA. If you immediately, we have very clear data on this. As soon as you get people to plan to do specific goal setting, they go negative. They go negative affect, they go into stress response, because all of a sudden people feel like they have to prove it. And that means that when you open with goals, the more specific you try to be, the more you're going to turn people off, literally close them down. So goals might be useful later in the process. For many people, they aren't useful at all. But for some people, they might be, but they certainly are not motivational. So every time somebody says, let's put another metric on the dashboard, they're also saying, let's close people's minds to being innovative or learning. Now, just to be clear, it starts in the positive emotional attractor almost all the time, but we need the negative emotional attractor. If you didn't have this morning, you wouldn't have woken up. At some point, you're going to figure out, what do I want for dinner? You need the negative emotional attractor to make a decision, to solve a problem. So the dilemma is we need both. I call it survive and thrive. Some people call the PEA flourishing. But in the process, what becomes very clear is that the body, the human organism, defaults into the negative state to protect the organism. So we have to oversample the positive if we want to have some semblance of balance. I have a paper that's coming out this month in Consulting Psychology Journal, a whole series of studies Dan Goleman and I did with some colleagues, John Kalu and Udayan Dar. But finally, I got to prove empirically what I used to tell my patients in the 70s. It's more important for you to do I have a number of PEA or renewal moments in each day that are brief than to have a long period of doing it. So you don't have just an hour to renew during a day, but let's assume you've got an hour. It's more important that you do 4 15-minute sessions throughout the day, spread out, than to take a whole hour at lunch. Secondly, it's really important to do a variety of things. I mean, I didn't have the data behind me back when I used to say to the alcoholics or drug addicts I was working with, staying sober and clean is important. But if all of a sudden you start doing something else becomes another addiction, you're just trading addictions. So back in the 70s, when people would work out for 6 hours a day, we'd call them fanatics. Today, I guess it's a little more normal, but or people sitting on their balls to work on these exercise balls. I mean, to work their core, that basically we think about these things differently, but nonetheless, you don't want to just exchange addictions. So part of the challenge is, how do we move in and out of these states? Now, what this is saying and applying it to coaching is that coaching with compassion, which is our phrase for coaching to the positive emotional attractor, coaching to the other person's values, the other person's vision, the other person's agenda, not yours, is effective. It will help people open up for learning and increases the likelihood that it's durable or they'll sustain any effort. When you coach for compliance, what you should know is you're getting revenge, you're catharting on the other individual or emotionally vomiting on them. And it may make you feel better because you get all this stuff out, but it's not helping the other person. And I'm not saying, I built and ran 2 companies for 11 years. I bought and sold companies. I've had various key administrative leadership roles at the university. I mean, I've fired people. So I'm not saying there aren't times in which you don't give people negative feedback. And I'm saying there are times in which sometimes you have to get divorced. So there are times when coaching for compliance is relevant, but not if you want to help somebody learn or change. So that's one of the reasons why, most of us know this, but we try to tell people, for God's sakes, if people need performance management and they need development, but don't do them at the same time. Do not what are you going to do next year to be more effective as a part of your performance review? Because you've now reduced the effectiveness of both things. So what we're discovering is that all of this is because our brains pick up on other people's emotions in 8 to 40 thousandths of a second. Unless you're on the autism spectrum, touch of Asperger's or a lot of it, which is a dysfunction in the neural networks that allow you to pick this up. And that's about 1.6% of the population. Everybody else, and unfortunately, it's a little bit more, it's a higher percentage of people in IT or finance or accounting or engineers. Anybody who does anything abstract or analytic. But on the whole, there aren't that many people that are really on the spectrum. That means that we're infecting people around us all the time, either positively or negatively. And it doesn't have to do with what we're consciously aware of, because it's deeper than that. Now, the stress syndrome, I'm not going to go over all the details. I've got videos on the MOOCs, and we talk about this in various of our papers. Suffice to say, within a moment, it's under a minute of getting into an annoying stress episode, your body secretes a set of endocrines, which are hormones and neurotransmitters. They have a double wallop. They right away start to shunt blood from your capillaries. So your blood pressure goes up, your pulse rate, and you breathe faster. But it's also doing this in your brain. Your body decides that the neural network, the motor neuron network, is more important because that keeps you breathing than a network in the hippocampus that might allow you to learn. But as our body starts to secrete corticosteroids, CRH, CRF, ACTH, cortisol enters your bloodstream, which is useful in some ways, but it has 2 nasty effects. It turns off your immune system, and it stops neurogenesis, which is your ability as an adult human to create new neurons. You're going to lose about 85,000 today. If you don't replace a certain number of them, you're going to have a spongy form kind of brain with a lot of holes in it way before you're ready to, as they say, meet your maker. But your brain will start to, even in your 40s or 50s, start to look like an autopsied brain of somebody who has Alzheimer's. So all of this means that when you're under this stress syndrome, which is the NEA, you tend to feel lousy and you tend to see things as threatening that may not be. So if somebody comes up to you and says, "Where's the report that's due Friday?" If you don't say it, you're likely to feel, "What's it to you?" And outside of New York City, that's a defensive response. So the dilemma is the opposite, which is renewal, is a different set of endocrines. When you see a baby laugh or a golden retriever puppy roll in the grass, oxytocin gets released primarily in women and vasopressin in men. And at this dosage level, it does the opposite. It opens up your blood vessels. It slows down your breathing. It clicks your immune system into high gear according to all the markers of the functioning of your immune system. It's in this state that you are cognitively at your best. You can handle the most complex concepts. You can be the most creative. You're the most open to learning a new idea and open to people, including people who look and sound different than you are. And this is where neurogenesis occurs. This is the state we want to be in. Now, we know there are a number of things you can do each day. I only put something on this list if there are a minimum of 5 published studies in medical or psychological journals. So quickly, we know that meditation helps. We know that yoga helps. We know that physical exercise helps if it's modest. Tai Chi helps. Prayer helps if it's to a loving God. If you're praying to a vengeful God or one that's, the representative of your spirituality is telling you you're a sinner, that goes the other way. That's a stress inducer. We know that feeling hopeful about the future helps. That's why I literally have been saying for the better part of 2 years, don't watch the news on TV. Being in loving relationships helps. Helping people who are less fortunate in the community, helping the elderly. I like to tell my students, helping elderly professors really helps get closer to heaven with that. Having pets like dogs, cats, or in some places horses or monkeys that you can pet. Because it turns out when you do that, when one of my golden retrievers comes up to me, if I stop what I'm doing, which my wife pointed out 34 years ago or 35 years ago, early in our marriage, if I just stopped and pet her, what happens is she goes into a parasympathetic renewal spot. I pick it up because of the emotional contagion, and then we're going back and forth. I added laughter, joy, and playfulness in 2009 to this list because we finally had enough studies. And 2 years ago or 3 years ago, I added a walk in nature because, again, I read the 5th published study. There may be other things that work for you. These are the ones that work for men, for women, for every race, and every country of the world where anybody's done this research, which is, usually about 140 of the 215 or so countries documented. So the message here is, this is what we're trying to help our clients with, but this is also what we have to tend to ourselves. And yes, if your client comes in and they just had bad news or they had a frazzling day, I know a lot of coaches who start with a deep breathing exercise. That's very effective because you want to get somebody into the positive emotional attractor. I've argued with the field of psychotherapy, even as a therapist. I've argued with clinical social workers for decades that I think most of the time, the talking cures, as they call it, psychotherapy, enable people to stay in the negative for way too long. So what are we saying? We think if you want to have the context for effective coaching, the hormonal research, the neurological research, and the behavioral research all tell us very clearly what you want to do is have vision, the person's dream, be the context, not a problem. And you want the quality of your caring relationship to be a part of the context, not their presenting problem. Of course, you should get to their presenting problem later in the process, but that's not the context for coaching if you want to be effective. We've got 39 published longitudinal studies showing impact. Above average MBA programs have a 2% impact and then they drop off. The best training in government and industry has an 11%, and we're reaching 62% within a year, and it levels off at about a 50% sustainable improvement in behavior. This is not self-assessment. The analytic network is the part of our brain that enables us, as I said, to make decisions and to solve problems. The empathic network in our brain, which these are different parts. The left brain, right brain thing was psychobabble. It's every part of your brain has right and lefts, and different parts of your brain switch which are what. So, but what we do know is that the networks in the brain, which connect all sorts of things, for the empathic enables you to be open to new ideas and people. The problem is Tony Jack, my colleague at Case, showed, people have been writing about this for a number of years, but he showed with a very large sample in a study that was published in 2013, that these two networks have almost no overlap and they suppress each other. So every time you do something analytic, you're suppressing people's ability to be open to new ideas or people, and vice versa. Now, when you think about this, and Tony and I had an article that came out in Consulting Psychology Journal 2.5 years ago, called The Neuroscience of Coaching, in which we reviewed research from the last, at that point, 10, 12 years in neuroscience. And one of the issues we were talking about is that you really have to appreciate these opposing domains. And as a coach, you want to be engaging in both, but you can't do them at the same time. So part of what we need to be doing to develop ourselves as coaches is learn to be very facile with cycling or toggling back and forth. And then knowing when it's important for you to be in the analytic mode, try to figure out what's going on with your client, versus being in the empathic mode and be feeling with them. It's kind of like a seesaw. So the two neural networks, the two hormonal systems, the PEA and NEA, are both necessary, but they both suppress the other. So what you want is a sense of balance. I'm going to go through this very fast. If you want more on it, like I said, I have articles and have videos, but we tested this 30 minutes of coaching someone to their vision, to their 10-year, 15-year dream, not goals, versus 10 minutes of how are you doing, what problems are you running into. 3 to 5 days later, they go into an fMRI and they watch these statements, and the PEA activates the lateral visual cortex, where we imagine things, and the PEA tended to activate parts of the posterior cingulate cortex, the ventral medial, orbital frontal cortex, parts of the empathic network. And the NEA tended to activate the anterior cingulate cortex, parts of the prefrontal cortex that are a part of the analytic network, which closed you down. We won an award with that paper, and as it was getting published, we did another study, went to 50 subjects instead of 20, half male, half female. We went to folks who were older, and again, we found the PEA, NEA pretty much paralleled the first study, and this time we tested how many PEAs would make a difference. And we found that 2 or 3 number of instances of PEA versus NEA during the coaching activated the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, this area in yellow, which Naomi Eisenberger has proved in multiple studies is the crosswalk. This is the part of the brain that once it gets activated, activates your parasympathetic nervous system.
So Richard,
So,
I give you the 5-minute warning here.
Yeah, thanks. I'm at the end.
Okay.
So I've given you 18 very practical things you probably are doing some of anyway, I hope, but really affirming that you should keep doing them and doing them more frequently. Consider smaller doses, but it's very practical. You could be doing this tomorrow. So what we're saying is, if you really want to be effective in coaching, what the neurological and hormonal research is telling us is anchor it and have the context be the vision or the resonant caring relationships. Focus on strengths. Of course, you're going to talk about weaknesses, but keep it to a minimum and use the PEA as the vehicle to help somebody shift. I started doing the first ever competency study of coaches several years ago. This is a call for your enrollment. This is the URL. We desperately need more coaches. I've gone out to 18,000, 20,000 coaches, and we now have 40 in the study. I know it's a pain in the rear. I need about 40 minutes of your time to fill out some surveys, talk to some peers so we can get a 360 on you. And then when you start a few coaching clients, see if you can send us their names that they might be interested in participating. We'd like 1 to 3 clients of yours. We'd ask them for 20 minutes now, and then a year from now, we'll go back to them for 20 minutes. For all the efforts we do on certification and training, it'd be nice if we had some evidence that what worked. We don't. And we certainly don't have any evidence on the competencies. And my review of the competencies, given the fact that I've been studying these things since 1970, is that 60% of the things in the competency models for ICF and CCE and these other places aren't even competencies. So I think this is going to be a real important study. Please, if you care about the field, help us. Our new book that Melvin, Ellen, and I had come out, we're really proud of. It reviews all of this research, but it's all told through people's stories. And lastly, we have an app based on the book and the MOOC that's be launching in later this spring. If you want to be a beta tester, let us know. So my concluding thought is you have a special gift from our God, life. Don't waste it. You owe it to yourself as well as all of your loved ones to be moving closer to your dreams. And if you talk to the probably 6.5 billion people on earth who don't have the freedom that we do to get closer, not necessarily achieve, but get closer to our dreams, they would say, go for it. So my entreaty to you is remember what it feels like in those great moments. And when you do, you become positively infectious. And in your families, in your communities, and at work, you'll find people coming together and doing things you never thought before were possible. Thank you.
Oh, Richard, thank you so much.